Hello and welcome to Breaking Down, the series where we take an in-depth look at a Fire Emblem unit from a gameplay perspective. Today, we will be taking a look at the daughter of Count Ordelia, Lysithea. Before we start, I would like to thank the people who have backed the channel on Patreon, where for just £1 a month, you can see the units that will be in this season of Breaking Down, as well as vote on the next unit from that list to be released. More on this at the end. Whilst this series is not focused around plot, there is always a chance for spoilers, and certain elements of the game and its structure and story will inevitably be mentioned, so if that is a concern for you, feel free to give it a miss. Also, where relevant, this is considering the maddening difficulty on a regular new game file with no exploits or excessive grinding. Lysithea is a member of the Golden Deer House, meaning that if they are your choice, you will have access to her from the outset. In any other case, she will need to be recruited. Lysithea's recruit requirements are in Magic and Faith, and vary based on her support rank with Byleth, the specifics being shown on screen now. Pursuing Faith with Byleth is usually going to be undesirable, so if you don't wish to do this, you can also get Byleth's support to a B rank with Lysithea, where she can then ask to join your house on any day following this. There is one other way to recruit Lysithea, which is exclusive to Crimson Flower. She will appear as an enemy in Chapter 14, where you will have the option to spare her after defeating her in battle. Doing so will result in her joining you once the battle has concluded. This is unique and the only unit who can have their initial recruitment come in this way in the game. It's probably better to pick her up earlier, but should you want to take advantage of her talents for the last few chapters and didn't pick her up then, it is something to consider. Lysithea's personal ability is Mastermind, which doubles the amount of class and skill EXP she gains during combat. This is incredibly valuable, making it much easier to gain access to higher ranked tools early on. This is especially prevalent on mages since during the early stages of the game, they can only do so much due to limited casts. One of the biggest advantages here is that you can get access to later game spells earlier or with less investment, since you are getting that little bit extra EXP for using them in combat. Mastering classes twice as fast is also very beneficial, since the tools you get from these can be very nice to have early. Lysithea also bears not one but two crests. The first is the Major Crest of Gloucester, which has a 20% chance to raise might by 5 during magic attacks. This is pretty nice, providing a chunk of extra damage 1/5 of the time. Often it will end up being unimpactful since it will either be on an attack that was already going to kill anyway, or just turn chip into more chip that ends up not doing much, but there will be occasions where it can secure a kill or save an extra attack, and most of the time that is a good thing unless you are trying to feed that kill to a specific unit. The second crest is the Minor Crest of Karen, which has a 40% chance to raise might by 5 when using combat arts. Combat arts will probably not be a common form of attack for Lysithea, but there are some she can make use of, and the 40% chance for an additional 5 might is pretty nice. It's also controllable thanks to the combat art conditional, which is useful to a degree. Ultimately though, I don't think you will see enough benefit from this one to really factor it in to a massive extent. The crests in general also mean Lysithea can use relics without taking damage, and provide some other small benefits with relics that align with her crests. I think it's worth looking at Lysithea's stats next, which are basically very bad apart from they aren't. To say she is underwhelming in most areas would be an understatement. Her strength is the sole lowest in the game at a miserable 4, not even enough to offset 1 point of weapon weight at base. HP, luck, and defense also all share the title of being the lowest amongst any units in the game, although in these cases she is tied with her peers. 4 stats being the lowest any student has does not sound like a great start for Lysithea, and with the growths for these peaking at HP's 20%, it's not like they're going to get better with time either. Resistance at 4 with a 25% growth is also not ideal. So with that out of the way, let's get into why Lysithea's stats are great for her. 11 base magic is really the key one, as this is extremely good, and with a massive 60% growth in the area, this will only continue to rise very nicely. This lets Lysithea pump out massive damage with magic-based attacks, and also aids her in the healing or utility aspects of her kit. Dexterity at a base of 7 is also respectable in its own right, and again with a 60% growth rate, will provide a nice accuracy enhancement to her throughout the game, ensuring that those huge hits can find their mark. Her speed is not awful for a mage either, with a base of 7 and a 50% growth. She isn't going to be throwing out doubles early on, but it can set her up to do so later against slower enemies, such as armor knights or some monsters, and in other cases it can let her eat attacks without being doubled herself. While she probably shouldn't be putting a unit with the lowest HP and defense at base in the firing line, this may just save her life should you find yourself in a situation where this is necessary. Or you can let her go for an attack that isn't going to kill or guaranteed to hit, as a single counterattack, whether that be in the same combat or on the following enemy phase, probably allows her to live, where a double may spell her death. Whilst Lysithea's stats definitely have their downside, the areas where they shine are the areas she needs the most, particularly that massive magic stat, and as an overall, this area of her kit ends up being a massive asset to her despite its very obvious drawbacks. It's also worth noting that due to the way class bases work in Three Houses, these weaker areas can usually be patched up to a reasonable degree by certifying for some classes, should you ever find a reason to want them to be higher. Now it's time to look at Lysithea's skills and the things she gets from them. She has boons in Reason, Faith and Authority, Banes in Swords, Lances, Axes and Heavy Armour, and a budding talent which also lies in Swords. This is a very wide spread of skills, and from the offset the sheer volume of Banes can look problematic. The key thing here though is the areas where these are. Some of these Banes, specifically the ones in Heavy Armour and Axes, are very unlikely to impact Lysithea at all, regardless of what you choose to do with her. The Lance Bane may have a little more impact. There could be some classes that you would consider to make use of that do use this, such as Dark Knight. However, even then, this impact will be very low, and I don't really see a world in which you ever need to take Lancers higher than the C rank, which even with the Bane is not too difficult to do, and this is still something that's rather niche and isn't likely to play an impact in most cases either. The Bane that turns into a budding talent lying in Swords is actually a positive for Lysithea, since from mastering this budding talent by tutoring her in the area 12 times, Lysithea gains access to Soulblade. This is a magical sword combat art, meaning that the damage of the attack is calculated using Lysithea's magic rather than her strength, and considering her magic is incredibly high, this is very beneficial. On top of this, it provides 2 points of might, as well as increasing might further, by 30% of the user's resistance. Lysithea's resistance isn't anything outstanding, but it still provides a nice damage boost, especially once you reach level 20 since all advanced classes provide 15 res at base. The main benefit here is being able to use weapons over spells, which can provide some nice damage amplifiers. Speaking of spells, let's get into the meat of Lysithea's boons, those lying in Reason and Faith. With Lysithea being a magically oriented character, boons in both areas is extremely beneficial, especially when coupled with Mastermind to accelerate these growths even higher. How potent these builds are rests heavily on the unit spell list, so let's take a look into this, where I can happily say Lysithea brings everything to the table. In both Reason and Faith trees, there are very powerful tools you can absolutely take advantage of. It's worth noting that Lysithea uses dark magic, meaning she benefits from dark magic boosting abilities rather than black magic ones like most characters. The first thing to touch on is the sheer power of these spells. Hades is, in terms of its raw might, the highest damage spell in the game, sitting at 18. Impressive, but 18 might for an A rank spell is nothing that's going to be blowing any minds. What really makes this spiral out of control is the situational damage from her other spells. Dark Spikes, available at B Reason, comes with only 13 might, but has effective damage against mounted opponents, which triples this to a massive 39, making it an absolute nuke to drop on anybody on a horse, which gets particularly notable with some of the bosses or mid-bosses that show up, such as the Death Knight, Leone, the Death Knight, Sylvain, a few of the Verdant Wind 22 elites, the Death Knight, Ferdinand, the Death Knight and Lawrence, and the Death Knight. Lysithea also gets access to Seraphim at C Faith, an 8 might spell with effective damage against monsters, tripling it to 24 when facing these, allowing for massive damage against some of the bulkiest enemies in the game. It's also worth noting that this effective damage lets her break the segment of barrier in a single blow. Luna from C Reason is another extremely effective spell, as whilst it only has 1 might, it completely ignores enemy resistance, meaning its effective might is the enemy's resistance plus 1. In the early game, this is nothing too special, but as you approach and enter Part 2, enemies such as Paladins, Pegasus Knights, and Mages will start to stack this rather high, and by the late game, even enemies such as Grapplers, Warriors, Snipers, Assassins, and Swordmasters see this rise to the 18 plus mark, whilst the high-res enemies mentioned earlier are all in the 30s. Beyond this, Swarm gives a nice attack speed debuff, which can be very useful in setting up kills early on, and coming at the D+ rank means it's quickly accessed for more casts overall. So it's been well established that Lysithea's spells can hit like a truck, but what tops this off is that her damage and combat potential are not the strongest aspect of her spell list. That comes from her B rank Faith spell, Warp. This lets you teleport an adjacent target ally to a tile that is within a range of 1/4 of Lysithea's magic, with the range's origin point being from Lysithea herself. Thanks to her very high stats here, the range on this is huge, and basically amounts to a ridiculous amount of added move for the target, whilst also avoiding any terrain, objects, or enemies that may be between you and your destination. Warp is one of the absolute premier tools a unit can get, and it being on a unit who has so much potency with it is incredible. Beyond the strength of the spell itself, the acquisition of Warp for Lysithea is incredibly easy. It is typically an A rank spell, however she gets it at B. She has a boon in the necessary area to make raising this very painless, and she also has Mastermind, which accelerates her faith growth even further. With all of this put together, Lysithea can get Warp as early as Chapter 5, which is absolutely insane for a spell of its caliber. Not only do you get it incredibly early, but since it comes at B rank, it doesn't require that much weapon XP either, meaning she isn't a massive resource hog for a long period of time. Now, for all of its massive strength, there are a couple of small drawbacks to Lysithea's spell list. Firstly, the dark magic spells can lack a fair bit of accuracy, making Lysithea have low hit rates, particularly in the early game. This has a secondary downside that a miss which costs Lysithea a kill in the first couple of chapters also slows down her progress towards level 5, something she is eager to reach to shrug off the half spellcasts that Noble brings. On top of that, all of Lysithea's spells are 1-2 range, which is a bit of a shame. The extra range would be greatly appreciated due to her fragility and the typical low move of magic classes, although there are tools to amp up said range later on. That aside, as an overall, Lysithea's spell lists are extremely good, and Warp is the biggest cherry on top of an already amazing cake. The final boon to discuss here is Authority, which is actually very nice. The E+ base and increased growth rate, again Mastermind plays a role here, makes it very painless for her to reach the D rank for the magic boosting battalions that arrive on Chapter 3. Considering your early investment will likely want to be spent unlocking some of those spells, this is greatly appreciated. Being able to do this without going out of your way to have to invest heavily lets you steam your way towards those all-important early spell unlocks without missing out on a useful battalion. As the game continues, this just makes it easier for her to reach the higher tier battalions, which again is always a good thing. Just before we move on, it's worth noting that Lysithea has no banes in riding or flying. This might sound minor, but it can be beneficial in letting her go into classes such as Dark Flier, Valkyrie, or Dark Knight without too much investment if you wish to, which can be solid flex options. That about wraps up Lysithea's skills, which are another area which on the surface can look a little rocky, but in practice are a massive asset to her, and a hugely positive area of her kit, particularly thanks to her possessing great spell lists in both Faith and Reason. When we talk about actually using Lysithea from a practical perspective, we have to address the elephant in the room that is warp skipping, which kind of ties into the entire point of the series, meaning I have to get a little meta. Before we get ahead of ourselves, I should explain what this is. Skipping is using a combination of tools to complete a map's objectives and therefore end the level within a very short span of time, typically a single turn. With Warp allowing you to send a unit a massive distance through the map, it is usually a huge component in these skips, hence the term warp skipping. Since Three Houses has a massive amount of maps where the objective is simply kill the boss, skips are incredibly viable and easy to pull off, especially with how early Lysithea can get Warp. Whilst this is obviously an extremely effective strategy, allowing you to beat most maps in the game without seeing an enemy phase, there is a glaring issue here, which is that a large amount of the player base tends to play games to, well, play the game and not skip it, which is obviously very understandable. Without wanting to get too off track, the point of breaking down is to give people viable high-performance builds and strategies to allow them to use their favourite characters in a way that really lets them shine. Whilst warp skipping definitely takes the high-performance aspect, it's questionable how useful it is to focus the whole video around a strategy that a lot of the player base doesn't enjoy using. It would be very easy to say, Lysithea gets warp, nothing else about her matters because every map she warps your strongest boss killer to the boss, you clear up as much as you can in one turn with your other units, and the level ends before anything else matters, and wrap the video up in the next 2 minutes. But I think if we do that, we're kind of missing the point. Fortunately, whether or not you choose to warp skip frequently, only do it for select maps, or not do it at all doesn't really affect Lysithea's build pathing too much. Warp is still an absolutely ridiculously strong tool that you will make great use of regardless of whether you are skipping or using it to facilitate standard play, and something that is build defining for Lysithea anyway, but it does affect the framing of some of the conversations. For this reason, I'm going to assume the player is using warp to skip maps sparingly or not at all, and that a good bulk of the maps are still being tackled in a way which is standard. I think this is how the majority of the player base will use the spell, still skipping some maps such as Chapter 5, Land of the Golden Deer, Oil and Water, or Sword and Shield of Seros, but not using it for every single map, or not skipping any map at all still being very likely. That's not to say warp still won't dictate a lot of the forthcoming discussion, but we will be considering it outside of the context of skipping for the most part. So with that in mind, let's get into actually using Lysithea. Her early game is definitely a little rocky. Dark magic lacks accuracy, and like all mages, she has to contend with the commoner and noble magic debuffs, which halves your spellcasts whilst in the classes. There isn't really too much you can do about this at this stage, but it's usually a good idea to feed your kills and experience to your mages as early as you can, and Lysithea is no exception to this. Hitting level 5 as early as possible is really crucial for getting them out of this tough spot, and in an ideal world, you would want to do this by the end of Chapter 2. When playing as the Golden Deer, Lysithea makes a solid case for being one of the units you take into Chapter 1. Firstly, Mastermind just gives more tangible benefits to having her partake in battle, since the limited combat she will see there benefits her more than other units. Past this, she also has some solid contributions in the map itself, with, for the time, high damage spells being ideal in taking out some of the bulkier enemies, such as Edelgard, Dimitri, and most notably, Dudu. As far as tutoring goes, you're going to want to push her faith up to that all-important B rank as quickly as possible. Warp is such an important tool that heavily investing to gain access to it early is absolutely worth it, especially with Lysithea getting it at just B faith, which means she can have it as early as Chapter 5. This is very desirable, and can be aided by investing into Lysithea's faith from the get-go, which outside of pushing you closer to Warp itself, also gives you access to spells like Heal and Nosferatu, which grant both opportunities for additional EXP from more spellcasts, but also additional Faith EXP, which is amplified by the benefits of Mastermind. It is also worth making sure that she reaches D Authority for Chapter 3 to be able to equip the magic boosting battalions, which with her boon, E+ base, and Mastermind shouldn't be too much hassle to do. You can also choose to make her a candidate for the Force Seminar, which is usually best done with Seteth. Most units appreciate this, but it will give a sizable bump to her authority at an important time. The only issue here is that the competition for spots is quite stiff, and while she enjoys the authority greatly, the Lancers aren't doing too much for her, so other units may be preferred. I also tend to give her the Seros Soldiers Battalion in the Forced Auxiliary battle, since she can level both the battalion itself and her authority with it equipped, whilst keeping it at full endurance since she won't be taking counterattacks when partaking in combat due to her range, allowing it to still be in top shape for Chapter 2. Her authority also benefits here more than most units will. Authority boons are quite rare, and once again Mastermind amplifies this even more. By default, Lysithea can qualify for Monk at level 5, and as the only beginner class able to use magic, this is obviously where you want to go at this stage. Mastering Monk also gives access to Magic +2, which surprisingly gives an additional 2 magic, and thanks to Mastermind will be acquired quite quickly for a little extra damage. It's also worth noting that this affects things outside of combat too, such as healing or the range of warp. The drawback combat art can also be a very nice repositional tool, and also give Lysithea the opportunity for further movement on any given turn, if used in the right positions. Since mages don't get a whole ton of useful combat arts, this will also see quite a lot of use throughout the game. On the way to getting Warp, Lysithea will also gain access to Seraphim, which makes her very apt at killing monsters, since this has an effective 24 might against them due to its effective damage. Once she gets that big B-rank warp spell, her usefulness skyrockets, the ability to teleport an ally giving her incredible utility. Thanks to her outstanding magic, the range on this will be pretty solid from the get-go, and only continue to scale further and further as the game progresses. Looking for opportunities to really make the most of this will truly let Lysithea shine. Outside of the aforementioned map skips, effectively positioning your enemy phase units or allowing your player phase units to quickly and efficiently reach their targets just greatly improves the performance of your whole team by a very sizable amount. The only additional thing to mention here is, whilst Warp is very powerful and valuable, don't be too conservative with it. When you see an opportunity to take advantage of it, don't hoard the cast in case a better one shows up later. You don't want to slog through to the end of a map with such a useful tool still available to you, which likely would have given you a much easier time. Once Lysithea has reached B Faith, catching her Reason rank up is the next priority. Dark Spikes at B in this area has a lot of impact due to the amount of mounted enemies present in the game, and thanks again to its effective damage, this essentially has 39 might against them, an incredible amount of kill power for a fairly common type of opponent, that can put almost any mounted unit in the bin. On the way here, when Lysithea reaches C Reason, she will acquire Luna. Whilst this won't have much immediate impact, as the enemy's level and their resistances increase, it only gets better and better. Even from the offset, however, this gives Lysithea a high amount of damage against enemies that pack a lot of resistance, such as Pegasus Knights, or opposing mages, meaning the spell will absolutely see use throughout the game, it just ramps up significantly as the enemies get stronger. The trio of spells of Dark Spikes, Seraphim, and Luna give Lysithea a great array of situationally high damage spells. 39 might against mounts, 24 might against monsters, and what is essentially enemy res +1 provides kill power which is rarely seen amongst spells in the game, and packs a lot of offensive potential into Lysithea. This is coupled with her exceptional magic stat that really helps her stand out. This is obviously alongside Warp, allowing her incredible utility too. At some point on the path to this, Lysithea will likely hit level 10, where she wants to go into Mage to acquire Fiendish Blow, which is gained from mastering the class. This ability grants 6 additional damage when the unit initiates combat, which can be very nice, especially since the class is ideal packing anyway. Another advantage of the Mage class is the ability Fire, which grants the spell of the same name. This is more accurate than Lysithea's other spells at this point, so it can be ideal in a lot of scenarios for more reliable chip or finishing blows. Unfortunately, you can't take Fire into other classes, but it is appreciated while you are here. So let's just run this back. Lysithea by this point will have access to Warp for incredible utility, and Dark Spikes, Seraphim, and Luna for great damage output. This puts her in a very strong spot, however there are some flaws here which we may want to touch up. The first of these is her mobility, which unfortunately is an issue that many mages have to contend with. For Lysithea, this issue is more noticeable as all of her spells are 1-2 range, with nothing going beyond that to help her hit from further away and compensate for the lower move. This weakness, coupled with her Crest of Gloucester, will always make her a great candidate for the Thyrsus staff, obtained from the Lawrence Paralogue, Land of the Golden Deer. You may recall I mentioned earlier that this is one you may want to consider warp skipping, meaning with Lysithea you can complete this as soon as it becomes available very easily. This relic grants 2 additional range to all magic attacks, allowing her to attack from 4 tiles away instead of 2, helping to compensate for her class's reduced movement. Thyrsus also provides the abilities Pervice and Aegis if the unit has the Crest of Gloucester, which Lysithea does. These are very low impact and unlikely to provide much benefit at all, however small benefits are still benefits, so it is another edge she has in staking a claim for the staff which most mages will greatly desire. Accuracy may also be another issue that Lysithea still faces here, however Mastermind may be able to assist with providing a solution, through the class Archer. It's a weird one for sure, but if you raise Lysithea's bows to D+, and gamble a qualification into the class, you can use her Mastermind personal ability, along with the Saint Statue's buff for class mastery and a knowledge gem, to very quickly master this. This can be done by using her as an adjutant on another unit. With all of these, she will gain 6 class XP per combat, so will need to participate in 17 combats to master the class, which if you glue her to the right unit is definitely possible in a single map. You can do this as an adjutant, or making use of the sword combat arts you can just do it on the map with her herself. It's up to you, although the former is definitely easier and quicker. If you partake in Orcs battles, this option gains a lot more merit, since you don't have to do it in an actual map. Doing this will provide Lysithea with hit plus 20, which increases the hit of all her attacks by 20. Whilst this is out of the way and will mean Lys is sidelined for one map at least, it is still quite a nice benefit to have. You could opt for Uncanny Blow from Valkyrie instead, which is a boost of 30 when the unit initiates combat. The caveat there is negligible, as Lysithea shouldn't really be taking hits on the enemy phase by this stage of the game as it is. The bigger issue here is that the investment needed is a lot higher, requiring 150 class EXP instead of 100, and also that the class comes a fair bit later at level 20. However, the class is significantly better for Lys to be in, and she can still master this while being a strong force in the battle itself, meaning you would never have to adjutant her. I personally prefer this option, however there are merits to both. You will also want to keep an eye on Lysithea's authority throughout the game, just to ensure she has access to any battalions she may want. It shouldn't be too hard to keep this where it needs to be, thanks again to the Boon and Mastermind, but you will just want to be sure she doesn't fall behind due to Faith and Reason hogging a lot of the early tutoring priority. A very ideal battalion is the McQueel Evil Repelling Co, as not only does it provide a huge boost of 7 might at max rank, but also a massive 30 hit. On top of that, it's an A rank battalion, which means Lys isn't stealing away a lower rank option from another unit who may struggle to reach these higher ranks, such as the Alliance Sages or Ordelia Sorcery Co. As for what class Lys will actually want to be in at an advanced level, Bishop is the way to go. Darkflyer and Valkyrie both have their advantages, but none of them outweigh the second cast of Warp on each map that is provided by the Bishop ability, White Magic Uses ×2. Darkflyer's Flight and Valkyrie's Dark Magic Range +1 have their merits, as does the increase in movement and Canto provided by each class, but those merits really struggle to compete against a second dose of Warp. Warlock is not really an ideal choice due to its limited movement and lack of skills that Lysithea benefits from, since she does not use black magic and cannot take advantage of the class's Black Tome Fair. From here, all that's really left is for Lysithea to push towards her final class, which is Gremory. This also provides Dark Magic Uses ×2 alongside White Magic Uses ×2, and the class provides a modifier of 5 magic whilst in it. On top of this, Gremory has an extra point of move over Bishop, allowing for greater mobility and in some cases, further warps, since as mentioned earlier, warp range is based on the position of the caster and not the target, so being able to warp from the other side of a unit lets you send them further. Gremory requires A Reason and A Faith to guarantee certification into the class. Considering the boons in these areas, along with Mastermind, this is absolutely attainable by the time Lysithea reaches level 30. This is basically her endgame, and she can run a build of Magic +2, Reason Prowess, Fiendish Blow, one of the accuracy skills, and whatever else you feel like slotting in on her, to be honest. If you unlock it, Dark Magic Range +1 is a great addition. She's basically good to go from here and doesn't need a whole lot more help at this point. She can warp around whoever she needs to and nuke a good number of enemies thanks to having spells like Dark Spikes and Luna. This about wraps up what I believe to be Lysithea's best build. That being said, there are other things you can consider. If you want Lysithea to focus more on a damage-oriented build from the get-go, rather than rushing warp as fast as possible, using the 3 weeks before Chapter 3 to pick up Soulblade by mastering her budding talent is a great option. This provides a very nice all-around damage option for very low investment, and also helps as a more accurate alternative to her Dark Magic, albeit only being viable at one range. Pushing swords up higher can allow her to certify into Thief at level 10, which can be gambled at D+, or guaranteed at C. This might seem a little odd, but it can provide her with some stat buffs, which on average equates to 4 strength, 3 luck, and 3 defense. Is this actually worth investing into? Not really. The stats aren't in areas you will get much use out of, but if you use Soulblade to the point where your swords reach this, along with the gains made from mastering the budding talent, there's no harm in picking up a couple of extra stats, even if they are low impact. There is one further advantage of pushing up her swords, which comes at the C rank, and that is the option to equip a Levin Sword Plus. Whilst not a powerful option compared to her other tools, it does come with that coveted 1-3 range that Lysithea lacks within her spell list. If Thyrsus finds another home on your team, this can be a valuable asset to have, just for when you need that additional bit of range to take out an enemy on the frailer side, and of course, the weapon's low might doesn't stop Lysithea's magic from still providing sizable damage. Since mages generally have fairly open inventories and the weapon is not highly contested, just carrying it around as an option can be very useful. You can also take Lysithea into a more mobile class if you wish to use her for more general combat purposes. The issue here is that because she uses dark magic, classes such as Mortal Savant or Dark Flier don't offer her a fair skill. That being said, her massive magic stack combined with the military grade weapons in her spell list can still let her thrive here, particularly taking advantage of Dark Flier's flight and canto for much better mobility, letting her blow up a high priority enemy and then retreat to safety. Valkyrie can also be a strong option here. Whilst it only has 6 move and lacks flight, it still brings canto to the table, and more importantly, the ability Dark Magic Range +1, giving Lysithea a much appreciated boost to her casting range. With other tools such as Thyrsus or the same ability from her own skills, you can increase this range even further. Ultimately, whilst I do think taking advantage of warp should be your main aim with Lysithea, if you want to use her primarily or even purely as an offensive caster, she will still contribute a great deal to your team. That about wraps up Lysithea, one of the most powerful and potent magic units in the game. I hope this helps you to get the most out of her. I would once again like to thank those who have backed the channel on Patreon, the support is greatly appreciated. When this goes live, the poll on there for the next unit to be released will have 24 hours remaining on it before the next one starts, so if you want to get involved and cast your vote on the next unit to be released, you can still do so for just £1 a month, a link is in the description. If you want to discuss this video, the channel, or Fire Emblem in general, consider joining the Discord. Thanks for watching.